Start recording. All right. Hey, come on in. Okay, so let me just go as we do. We'll start by going back and seeing if there's anything from last week that was kind of hanging out there for you that you were just like, I don't think we really resolved that, or I still have some questions. We're going to be digging in here in just a bit to chapter 2 of Nahum. But I don't want to just blow through it without,
Yeah, I wasn't here last week, but I listened to your video. But I was looking at the notes and it said something about that Nahum was not in is it the Catholic?
It's in any lectionary.
Okay.
So it's what's called the Revised Common Lectionary, which is, it's the one that's the most widely held by most denominations.
Okay, I wasn't sure whether you were referring in the notes to that or to a particular, like the Roman Catholic Bible or something.
No.
I was wondering why it was chosen to go into the Bible.
Well, that's what we're digging around to find out. Yeah, but so the short answer is that it was, it's part of the Hebrew scripture, so it's part of the prophetic tradition for the Hebrew people. So long before Christianity, long before Jesus, this was part of their canon. So the Hebrew scriptures would contain the Torah, so the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Greek is Pentateuch, and then the prophets, the Psalms and the teachings, the books of wisdom. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that was part of their tradition, and Nahum was part of that tradition. But as far as Christians go, we tend to avoid Nahum. I've never in my life ever heard a sermon on Nahum. I had never heard one on Habakkuk, but I do know that Habakkuk is part of the lectionary. So you guys know what I mean by lectionary, right? Okay, so if you have no idea what I'm talking about with the lectionary, okay, so there is an agreed upon pattern and sort of way of preaching texts that are part of what's called the Revised Common Lectionary. And so there is, in the Revised Common Lectionary, it's a 3-year cycle. So you have year A, B, and C. And within that 3-year cycle, each day, actually, there's a daily lectionary that's part of the Revised Common Lectionary. But for preaching purposes, every Sunday has that's part of the lectionary as well. So a lot of churches will follow the lectionary. That means that they'll be preaching from the texts that are part of that. So you'll have an Old Testament text, there'll be a psalm, there's a gospel, and an epistle. Okay, so they choose, so basically preachers are given the opportunity to choose from one of those passages, and they can preach from one of those passages. And then the other passages are also connected to that passage. So they all kind of work together. So the idea is, that over the course of the 3 years, you will preach or read. If you read through the lectionary, you'll read or be taught most of the Bible. Now, Nahum and Obadiah are both missing from the Revised Common Lectionary. There's nothing there. Yeah.
Is that essentially non-denominational?
It is. It is.
Because the Sunday you preached on, not last Sunday, Sunday before last.
Right.
I went to an Episcopal church, and the same topic or Bible verse or whatever was used.
So I was actually preaching from the lectionary from the beginning of Lent all the way through Pentecost. And now we're not. So we're not preaching from the lectionary this summer. And we probably won't pick it up again. I'm just debating. I doubt this year because of what I'm thinking about preaching for Advent. I probably won't preach from the lectionary per se. I've done it before where I did 3 years once, 3 years straight. I decided I was going to do the whole thing, Did you preach from the lectionary? Is that you were a lectionary preacher? Yeah, so there's a lot of great material that you can use, and I've got really great commentaries and stuff that help with lectionary preaching. So it is tempting sometimes to do that. So every once in a while I'll get back into it. We did the 3-year cycle, and I got all the way through it, and my congregation at that time was tired of it. They were tired of they were like, we want to hear. They wanted to. They liked. And here's the thing. So even though I was preaching from the lectionary, I would group them into series. So I would try to create a series out of the lectionary text. So a lot of them go together. So that's what happened with the Book of Acts, for example. We did a whole. We were preaching from the lectionary for the entire season of Easter, and it all came from the Book of Acts. So that was an easy one. I was like, we got a series right there, right? It's all in Acts. Now you got to figure out like what to do. So there's a lot of preachers that'll do that, but the Revised Common Lectionary is that agreed upon. And I don't know if the Catholics, I think they do something different. I think, yeah, because they include books that we don't have. So they have like, Baruch and Sirach and a whole bunch of other ones. Yeah, what's that? From the Apocrypha. Yeah. So they have theirs is a bit different, but. Hey man, how's it going?
And excuse me, how do you spell that?
Lectionary.
Is it with an X or L-E-C?
No, it's CTION. So like lectern, lectionary. Yeah, it all comes from that same kind of. So yeah, we hadn't really gotten started yet. There was a question about the lectionary and why this kind of like Nahum is not part of the Revised Common Lectionary, and so you don't really hear sermons from it or hear it taught and so forth. And we're discovering why. There's some challenging things. It was really funny. I was doing a search today. We were picking hymns for the summer. So I was working with our intern to kind of pick hymns for all the different services. Well, not the 9:30 service, just for the 11:11. And so I was trying to find also some passages of Scripture that we could read for the lay leader to read for Scripture reading. And so we were doing some stuff on hope. And one of this guy, this guy was like, here's 17 Bible verses on hope, And one of them was Nahum. It was Nahum 1:7. And I was like, idiot, you pulled that right out of context, the poor fool who goes and then reads that and goes, oh, that's such a nice verse, and then reads the rest of it. They're like, whoa! But it is a nice verse. The Lord is good to those who hope in him, a haven on a day of distress. He is mindful of those who seek refuge in him. So it's that one little island in the middle of the whole passage. All right, so why don't we jump into chapter 2. Just grab a seat anywhere. There's the sheets available on all the tables. Like I said, I'm going to be reading from the Jewish Study Bible, and so it's going to probably sound a little bit different in some contexts. And so, if you have a different translation, you can kind of fill in some of the things. There are disputed words that a lot of the different translators will they'll use different words to describe what they're trying. Some of this within Nahum, as we learned last week, we don't know exactly. Sometimes the meaning is unclear, and we have some of that. We have some of that today as well. So let's jump right in, and we'll read through it. I think it's good to just read through it. Let's read through it once, and then we'll go back and we'll start working our way through kind of the text of how this is working. Okay, so all right. Oh, what you looking for, sir?
We're looking for a Greek group?
Oh, yeah, they're in the library. Oh, thank you so much. All right. So it says, behold on the hills the footsteps of a herald announcing good fortune. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah. Fulfill your vows. Never again shall scoundrels invade you. They have totally vanished. A shatterer has come up against you. Man the guard posts. Watch the road. Steady your loins. Brace all your strength. For the Lord has restored the pride of Jacob as well as the pride of Israel, though marauders have laid them waste and ravaged their branches. And so then this is an unclear reference here. So it starts off with his warriors' shields are painted red. Does somebody have anything different?
I don't know what this is.
Mine starts out with a shatterer.
Okay.
That's the beginning of the chapters, is a shatterer has come up against you. So the first part you read isn't even in, this is in RSV.
Yeah.
So it's right in
Yeah.
there.
So there it's in the Hebrew version, so maybe we should lean on that. All right, so it starts off with a shatterer has come up against you. All right, so
Who says scatters? Are you saying?
scatter. It's also translated. Some people have translated it scatterer, or someone who has scattered. But the actual translation is probably more accurately shatterer.
What was the first part you read again?
The first part that I read is this: Behold on the hills the footsteps of a herald announcing good fortune. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah. Fulfill your vows. Never again shall scoundrels invade you. They have totally vanished.
Yeah, so that's 15 and
Okay, so they have it included here as verse 1 of chapter 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the translation, this particular translation from Hebrew into English, moved 15 to verse 1.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Which, like I said, you're going to see some of this as we read through it, right? So this is probably more accurate, honestly, what I'm reading from. And I have another version, another new translation from Robert Alter, who and I compared the two. The reason why I didn't bring his translation in is because it's freaking huge. It's like that huge, and I was like, I don't want to put that on my podium. It's going to sink. So I brought this one in, and they're very close. So the Hebrew translation is definitely a bit different. Okay, so in verse 3, this is what I have. For the Lord has restored the pride of Jacob as well as the pride of Israel, though marauders have laid them waste and ravaged their branches. Okay, so the next verse, so we'll just kind of keep going. So the next verse, this is where there's an unclear reference, and you guys may have something different. It says his warriors' shields are painted red, or the shields of his warriors, if you might have that. So the reference there is there's nobody that it's referring to. So that's why it's an unclear reference. If you go back into the passage, there's who are they referring to? So this is what we're going to dig around a little bit in. And the soldiers are clothed in crimson. The chariots are like flaming torches. On the day they are made ready, the arrows of cypress wood are poisoned. That's what he has. What do you guys have for that?
We don't have anything about arrows.
Don't have the arrows.
Yeah.
Fire, cypress.
Yeah. So you can see how difficult this is, right? You got these really smart people that translate the Christian Bible, right, into NIV and NRSV, and then it's completely different than the actual rabbinical and Hebrew scholars that are translating theirs. So the chariots dash about frenzied in the fields. They rush through the meadows. They appear like torches. They race like streaks of lightning. And then this was my verse 6, whatever it is for you guys. He commands his burly men. They stumble as they advance. They hasten up to her wall where wheeled shelters are set up. The floodgates are opened and the palace is deluged. Okay, and then this is a weird one. I don't know what you guys have for this next one. And Huzzab is exiled and carried away while her handmaidens escort her as with the voices of doves beating their breasts. Nineveh has been like a pool of water, like a placid pool of water from earliest times. Now they flee. Stop, stop. But none can turn them back. Plunder silver, plunder gold. There is no limit to the treasure. It is a hoard of all precious objects. And then the next verse is desolation, devastation, and destruction. Spirits sink, knees buckle, all loins tremble, all faces turn ashen. What has become of that lion's den, that pasture of great beasts, where lion and lion's breed walked, and lion's cub with none to disturb them? Where is the lion that tore victims for his cubs and strangled for his lionesses and filled his lairs with prey and his dens with mangled flesh? I'm going to deal with you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn down her chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your great beasts. I will stamp out your killings from the earth, and the sound of your messengers shall be no more. Okay, so just kind of let's think through this just a bit. I mean, so there's the structure of this passage is actually super fascinating because you've got all kinds of sort of, there's all kinds of genres of Hebrew literature that are kind of jammed together. And so it kind of creates something that's a little bit new to a certain extent, or different at least. So the very first part of it, if you take what was verse 15 in chapter 1 and move it down, and then it becomes the call now to the people that are in Judah. So the first part of the entire section there versus what you guys would have would be verses 1 and 2, I think, that ends with the pride of Jacob, pride of Israel, that part of it. So at that point, the messenger, the prophet, is addressing the people in Judah, right? So, and we talked about this. The people of Judah was the old southern kingdom of Israel, and we talked about how the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel, they had separated after the time of Solomon. There was a rebellion, and so the 10 northern tribes were Israel, and the southern tribe was Judah, essentially Judah and Benjamin. And so the 10 tribes that are in the north, they are the ones that are ravaged by the Assyrians and destroyed, right? And so Judah is the kind of the remnant. But if you've lived with that story, if you've lived with the knowledge and and there had to be refugees, there had to be people that made their way down to Judah to tell the tale of what had happened. So it was widely known, what the Assyrians had done. But the 10 tribes were no more, really, essentially. So there was only the remnant left in Judah. And so as the now representative of the northern and southern kingdoms, what is left, Judah is now here to bear witness to the destruction of the enemy of Israel. Sort of an avenge, there's something that has been avenged here. And so with verse 15 of chapter 1 that you guys is for you guys, for me it's in this one is verse 1 of 2. So behold on the hills the footsteps of a herald. So the herald is now coming to tell the people of Judah what has happened. You got to think that that's kind of a contrast of the unspoken sort of thing that happened, sometime earlier when the heralds that came to proclaim that the northern kingdom had fallen. So now they're told to celebrate their festivals. They're told to fulfill their vows, right? So there's a saying when people when you leave, like if you have in Jewish context, like if you have a Jewish friend and you guys are parting ways, you're saying goodbye. Kind of the saying that people have in Israel would be like, well, next year in Jerusalem, right? There's just this constant sort of connection to the festivals and to fulfilling your vows, to being connected to these kinds of things, and also the prayers and the supplication that people have for the restoration of Jerusalem for many, many years. And so this is one of those things that is kind of predates that, but to a certain extent, that's what they're doing. They're the speaker is saying, fulfill the vows that you made, which the unspoken thing is you made vows that you would sacrifice and you would do certain things to God if God did this. Do you know what I mean? So like the implication is that there was a bunch of you that were probably praying for this, and guess what? It happened. Judgment has fallen upon them. Now, this is kind of an interesting statement. Never again shall scoundrels invade you. They have totally vanished. Well, shucks. That wasn't true. And the interesting thing is that we're going to be able to comment on that. There's a bit of that's sort of embedded in this. When you idealize brutality, when that becomes the language with which you speak, it becomes all the easier then to fall prey to it, right? To not only become what you hate, but also then to fall prey to it, because it's not many years until Jerusalem is completely destroyed, and the temple is burned to the ground. So the shatterer, some of you have scatterer, which I think is there was some liberties that have been made in that particular translation, because both I think probably work, and they're both sort of true. The shatterer is someone who comes and is going to shatter the walls and shatter the city. But if you use the word scatter, it also works because that's what happens to the people in the city once once it's destroyed. They're scattered. So there's a contrast here between what has happened to Israel, which is the unspoken thing that you all know, right? So you are all citizens of Judah and the southern kingdom. So you all get this, right? We don't have to go into the details. All we have to do is have a few little references here, and you understand exactly, because this is what happened. The Assyrians did this, and now it's been done to them, right? So man the guard post, watch the road, steady your loins, brace all your strength for the Lord. But see, the interesting thing is, it's not. The prophet is not saying brace all your strength and steady your loins. Does anybody have gird up your loins in any of your gird? I've always loved that.
No, fortify.
Fortify your loins. In the King James, it was probably gird. In the NR, to gird up your loins. It's a wonderful. There's all kinds of ways to kind of interpret that. I think. It's just get your midsection together there, friends. I'll just leave it at that. All right, so brace all your strength. For the Lord has restored the pride of Jacob. Okay, so the pride of Jacob in that particular context really does connect to the northern kingdom of Israel. And then the way that this is used now is that the pride of Israel refers to the southern kingdom, which is kind of a weird way of doing that, but that's what the rabbinical scholars believe. So you're now basically telling these people you're holding the flag now for this, right? You are here to bear witness. The marauders have laid them waste and ravaged their branches. So then it jumps into the actual battle itself. So there's the way that this moves is super awesome. I mean, if you read through it, you see you can feel the action within the text itself. It's really beautiful and poetic. You can see, he's using color. His warrior shields are painted red, and the soldiers are clothed in crimson. The chariots are like flaming torches. I mean, so there's all of this red. There's all of this symbolic use of color in this particular context. So, obviously blood, the frenzy of battle. You see red when you're angry. I mean, all those kinds of things is all part of this. So you begin the battle scene, so to speak, with all of this stuff. The frenzy of chariots as they rush. They appear like torches. They race like streaks of lightning. So you can imagine this battle taking place. And then, I don't know if you remember from last week, for those of you who weren't here, maybe if you watched the video, you might have been able to catch some of that. But there was there's a a Greek historian that wrote about this. And I remember I told you last week that the king was Sardanapalus, all right? So I got this right, Sardanapalus. So Sardanapalus was the guy that remembered there was an oracle that had said that the river would attack the city, and if that happened, then that was the end of the city. And so in this particular case, the author doesn't really doesn't really overtly say that God caused the flood, but that it is in divine terms, that God was in the midst of it, right? That God sort of approved of this. So here you kind of see what's happening. The burly men, or whatever you guys have, they stumble as they advance. They hasten up to the wall of the city. They've got those wheeled siege engine things that they use, right? That they'll go up to the walls, and they're shooting arrows and they're pouring oil and trying to light them on fire, and they're coming up to the wall, and then they open up the floodgates. So in this particular context, it's the attacking army that initiates the flood. Now, we know from the historical context that there was heavy rains. There was already a lot of flooding. It was the perfect time to attack the city, in other words. So the Babylonians and Medes knew exactly what they were doing. Interesting thing about the Medes, the Medes were just kind of mercenaries, right? And so when they got tired of the Babylonians, the Persians hired them, and then the Medes and the Persians took the Babylonians, and conquered them. And these are all people that are from the areas of Iran and Iraq. Okay, so this is all in that area. The guy, the king, because he saw this oracle and because he realized in his own mind that things were not, the city was doomed. So he loads all of his concubines, all of his eunuchs, and everybody else, his servants and so forth, all of his the large quantity of his gold and costly clothes and all this stuff, and then he sets everybody on fire and burns himself and everybody alive. And so whatever was not burned was destroyed by the entering armies. So Diodorus, the historian, says, "So great was the multitude of the slain that the flowing stream mingled with their blood, changed its color for a considerable distance." There was unparalleled looting. For centuries, the wealth of the ancient world had been pouring into Nineveh. And this is all that we're going to see here in just a little bit. So I'm going to read some of the stuff that, so you can get an idea of like what was there. So here's something that's really weird. And Hazab is exiled and carried away while her handmaids escort her. As with the voices of doves beating their breasts, Nineveh has been, so then it skips on to the plundering. So, as with the voices of doves beating their breasts. What do you guys have for that? Does anybody have anything different?
I just have the soldier.
Yeah.
Well, for Vehusab, I've got, and Vehusab, it is decreed, or
Right.
it is determined, as opposed to trying to use it as a proper name, because that seems a little weird.
Yeah,
So,
it's a disputed,
yeah,
it's a disputed reference that is unclear. So there's a couple of things that scholars have done with it, and so they've some of them have used it as a proper name. Does anybody else have a proper name in it, or do you have you do? So some of them have used it as a proper name, and they've assumed. Then I think this is probably kind of a more narrow approach to the text, where they would assume that it referred to a noblewoman. And so maybe they didn't know the noblewoman's name, right? But the idea of the queen that is being spared but is then being exiled. There's also significant scholarship that indicates that this is a reference to Ishtar. And Ishtar was one of the patron deities of the Assyrians and of Nineveh itself. So Ishtar was, just like, it was a goddess. And it was a bad movie as well. Yeah, it goes down in history as a bad movie.
The worst.
Excuse me, why would mine say "and the soldier"? That would be a male kind of reference.
It is, yeah, and and I think there have been in some of the variants, in some of the source material there are variants that have removed any of the feminine language, which happens sometimes. But there's enough source material that we know that the feminine language is in there. So that's why people will they'll debate whether it's just, you know, a word as opposed to a proper name. But you know, we don't know. It's unclear. But what is kind of clear there, and I kind of lean more towards the deity kind of thing, you know, like sort of I'm trying to think of a correlation. It's like a derogatory term, you know, that I'm not going to use that one. Yeah, I'm not going to use it. I don't want to get political, but what happens is sometimes politicians will use diminutive terms for one another. And sometimes some politicians will use diminutive terms for women. And so, you know, that woman or that thing, you know what I mean? So it's like a dismissive thing, like I'm not even going to use your name, right? What was it was John John Knox actually wrote a treatise because they were so opposed to Queen Mary, right? The Mary Tudor, the Bloody Mary. So they were so opposed to her. And then also, you know, as a Protestant, he wasn't a fan of the Virgin Mary. And then there was Mary of Guise, who was the mother of Mary Queen of Scots, who was kind of running things in Scotland. And so he had this whole thing where he basically just denigrated all three of them, you know. And his treatise was like the final blast of the trumpet at the monstrous regiment of women. So, of course, then Elizabeth becomes queen, and she's Protestant, and so he kind of has to, you know, well, that was just about them, you know, and not about you. You know, you're different. So anyway, yeah. So it could be that what's happening there is this is a way of diminishing the goddess by not even using her name and just saying that woman has been exiled. Her priestesses, right, are walking out, beating their breasts. So then it moves into the plundering. So the city is overrun. You see that. You see the chariots. You see the battle ahead of time. You see the city overrun, the flood, and then now the goddess, the protector, has left, and now there's nothing to protect the place from being plundered. And so from earliest times, it says they have been a placid pool of water. Or what do you guys have for that?
Where are we?
It's probably verse
8.
verse 8 for you guys.
Nineveh is like a pool whose waters run away.
Okay, so the way that this is translated essentially is like this has been a pool of water for a long time, and then now all of a sudden the pool is getting drained, right? And so, you know, now it's on, right? So the water, not only is the water pouring through, the wealth is pouring out, right? Diodorus says, using a phrase which he does not employ in any other description of a city's fall, because he was kind of a guy that in the ancient world did these histories. They plundered the spoil of the city, a quantity beyond counting. The royal reports of Nineveh speak again and again of its measurable wealth. So there's the black obelisk of Shalmaneser II, which I think is maybe is it in the Louvre? No, I don't know where it is. I think it might be somewhere in England. So many things are. All right, so this is some of the tribute. The tribute of Sua the Gilzanite. which is people that no longer exist. Silver, gold, lead, copper vessels, staves for the hand of the king, horses, camels. Tribute of Iaius, or in our English, Jehu, right? One of the kings, son of Omri. Silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden beaker, golden goblets, pitchers of gold, lead. Tribute of Carparunda of Hatina. Again, silver, gold, lead, copper vessels, ivory, cypress. And so then there's another slab that talks about some of the lists of things that have been taken to Nineveh. 2,000 talents of silver, of gold, 3,000 talents of copper, 5,000 talents of iron, colored woolen and linen garments, an ivory bed, and ivory couch. And then Sargon the Great lists this stuff. A royal tent, a golden palanquin, which I have no idea what that is, a royal throne, golden scepter.
One of those carries.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and he sits it in the...
Through the city and...
Oh, and then when he sits down, it's got like staves in it, right, to put it down. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You can see the spots in Israel where Ahab's were, where like they would when they would carry it in, they would sit it down, and then he would sit there. Yeah.
Is there a reason for going to list all that stuff?
Yeah, there is. I'm just telling you this is all the crap that was there, right? It was a ton of stuff. The great hosts of Assur plundered for 3 days and nights and carried off countless spoil. And here's the interesting part. 90,580 people, 2,500 horses, 610 mules, and 854 camels. So the water is draining away.
How much of that is like no context whatsoever? Like some of the balance between the symbolic nature of the numbers versus like the specific nature of the numbers. Like, do we have enough information there to?
Who knows? I mean, you would like to think that there was some accurate sort of accounting, but there was so much posturing in the ancient world. And as we discussed when we showed the story of Sennacherib, who came and besieged Jerusalem, and Hezekiah. So his version of the story was that he utterly overwhelmed Hezekiah, had him trapped like a bird, and carried a whole bunch of people away. And then in the scripture it says that that there was something that happened. It left a whole bunch of Assyrians dead, and they all left. And didn't do anything to Jerusalem. So, there's a lot of posturing in the ancient world about numbers and so forth, and so it's hard to know. But I guess what we do is we look at that and you realize, like, okay, this is a place of unbelievable wealth, a repository of the wealth, and this, as the prophet is speaking here, this was stuff that was stolen from other countries, other cities, other civilizations, and from us, right? And now, look at it run away, right? It's being plundered like water.
Yeah, that was one of the front. There's a they that, as you were talking, Mike. So it's like as if the river runs away, the people run away, the treasure runs away, all of it drains away, and then what is it? Mine has halt, but no one or nothing turns back.
It's gone. Plunder silver, plunder gold. There is no limit to the treasure. It is a hoard of all precious objects. So now we have the plundering, and then now there's the utter destruction, right? So there's an alliteration that happens here, which you guys have here with all the shuns, desolation, devastation, destruction. Do you have that? Okay, so in Hebrew that's buka, Umavukah, Umavalakah. Right, so they all sound the same. Desolation, devastation, destruction. So the interesting thing about that, with the way that the prophet is using alliteration and the way that the prophet is using poetry, right? So there's super symbolic language, incredible imagery. Connecting the flow of plunder with the flow of the floods that had flowed into the city and then flow out, right? So there's an interesting thing that kind of happens with this, is that it takes on, in a weird way, the sort of language of lament. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little taste, if I can. If I can find it. This is the problem with using a Hebrew Bible. Everything's in a weird spot. All right, hold on. Where did they put it? Maybe they don't even have it in here. All right, somebody give me, somebody have a Bible. Just do Lamentations really quickly. I can't use my phone, so.
Lamentations what?
So any part in Lamentations really. All right. Okay. Let's start with 1. This is after the destruction of Jerusalem, okay, by the Babylonians. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. How like a widow is she who was once great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. And then you go on. In verse 10 of chapter 1 of Lamentations, the enemy laid hands on all her treasures. She saw pagan nations enter her sanctuary, those you had forbidden to enter your assembly. It just goes on and on and on. And then in chapter 3, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. So this is all about, God, kind of doing this. So if you go through the book of Lamentations, which is seriously poetic and beautiful and tragic, you find the same kind of language that you find here, which is really interesting considering the fact that the author is not lamenting. So the alliteration that you have there, the buka, umavaka, umavalaka, all of that essentially means it's hollowed out, it's empty, it's done, it's destroyed. Knees buckle, all loins tremble, all faces turn ashen. And then we have this interesting thing about lions. Yeah, so if you go to any museum that has an Assyrian section, like ancient Assyria, it will be dominated by images of lions. In fact, sometimes the king would even have or like the guardians of the gates or whatever would be they would be the guys with the big, huge, long beards, but they'd have bodies of a lion. The Assyrian kings, it was like a ritual sort of thing for them to hunt lions in a very controlled atmosphere. To be fair. But what kind of beast would a king hunt? And so they would actually have lions that they would breed. They would have, places where they had them. Who else had lions that someone almost got fed to, right? So the Medo-Persian, kings had them as well. And, so all of these, so you read the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, and, that's what that was about. I mean, it was definitely convenient to toss your enemies in there or somebody that, fed you the wrong soup or something. But the real reason there was ritual stuff and even sacrifice. So one of the fascinating things that you will find when you go to the ancient site of Har Megiddo, or the Tel Megiddo, are some ancient, so even all the way back into Canaanite era, and then going forward, there were all kinds of altars and so forth, and they found the bones of lions as part of the ritual sacrifices and so forth, that were part of all this. So Megiddo was part of the Assyrian Empire as well. But this was just part of what it meant to be a king in the ancient world, is that you would you would ritually kill. And then they were depicted as lions as well. So it was kind of a synonymous thing. So the idea of a lion as Assyria, this is what the author is doing. This is what the prophet's doing. Is connecting it. Where's your, where's your lions now, right? All your lions. Where are you? You think you thought you were so tough. You did all this stuff. You tore victims for your cubs. You strangled for your lionesses. You filled lairs with your prey and dens with mangled flesh. I'm going to deal with you, declares the Lord of hosts. So what do you make of this particular passage?
You know, what strikes me between Jonah and Nahum is that Jonah is so devoid of a lot of imagery and explanation, and this one is so vivid that you almost believe this one more than the other one. That the Lord spared than the other one. I mean, this is really full of everything.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that it's extraordinarily detailed, and it marks the flow of what happened in the actual battle. So this particular commentary is published by a pretty conservative publishing company, Baker Books. And so in their estimation, the author is writing about what is going to happen. In almost every other commentary, it states that that's not the case because of a lot of different reasons, chief of which is the attention to detail and the fact. So the author is interpreting what happened. And so the images are very vivid. This was shared with them. And so, but the way that it's interesting, the way that the prophet interprets it, that's the most important thing, right? How the prophet interprets it to the people is important, and the poetic language is also super important.
Okay, so the prophet is explaining history, not a prophecy.
Prophecy in the Hebrew tradition is not telling the future, ever. In the moments where there is the outcome is uncertain, the prophet will give a possible outcome if certain things are done or if certain things are not done. So that's the work of the prophet. The prophet steps into a situation and clarifies the word of the Lord to the people about that particular moment. But there are also prophetic works like this and others. Some of Daniel would be considered. I mean, and Daniel kind of it kind of is on a border between like what would be considered apocalyptic literature, which is definitely supposed to be understood, not to be guessed at. But a lot of prophets would then say, this happened, and people are going, why did this happen? And then the prophet would speak. So a lot of people believe that Lamentations was attributed to Jeremiah, who was a prophet. So then Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, is giving the possible outcomes of all the things that are going to happen if you don't do what God wants you to do. The people don't do, or the leaders of the people don't do what God wants them to do, and the city falls. So then in Lamentations, if you believe that it's Jeremiah, and honestly it doesn't really matter, it's a person who has a prophetic voice, they are then interpreting what happened, right? So the passages I was reading you from Lamentations is a person who's essentially doing this work. The city fell, the temple's destroyed, Jerusalem is gone, and there's a remnant of us left, and we're walking around days. Have you ever seen the photos of from, I mean, even now in Syria, You know, there were, you see the photos of like Aleppo and of homes and these cities that were once thriving cities with cafes and apartment buildings and neighborhoods, and then you see the same thing afterwards. It's just destroyed, and the people, like, it was amazing to me, like the contrast between the people who are eating and smoking cigarettes and having coffee on the street in homes, and then shattered walking through the streets looking like they're dead. This is Lamentations. You know, this is the world of Lamentations, interpreting why this happened with a lot of detail because they were there. The person who I believe the person who's talking here, Nahum, who is given the name Nahum, which means consolation. You know, so that person is interpreting to the people of Israel, this is what just happened, and here's why it happened. So rejoice, therefore, right? Because these people finally got what was coming to them. But the interesting thing about this is that it's almost, and it's not like it's not a new form of poetry, because I think there's a lot of this kind of poetry in the Psalms as well. But I was really fascinated when I was doing some study on this, that some scholars believe this is kind of like resistance poetry. You know? Have you ever, do you guys remember when, and it's not that long ago, so I'm sure most of you do, that with the Troubles in Ireland and, you know, all of the things that were going on. So I went to my roommate, one of my roommates, his parents were like immigrants, like off the boat immigrants. They had like the brogue and everything. They lived in Syracuse, New York. There's a pretty big community of people from Ireland and you know, Irish descent in Syracuse. So we went with him. You know, I was visiting with him, and we went to this big dance that they have. It's like these big Irish dances. You know, so everybody, all the young women and men get up and they do the Irish dancing, and then there's a lot of drinking. I was stunned. I was like, oh my gosh, these stereotypes, man, they're true for a reason. And so my friend, typical kind of Irishman, as soon as he got a few in him, he wanted to fight. But see, what would happen is like, it was like up until then, like all the songs were like, you know, kind of like, you know, whiskey in the jar, you know, and, you know, songs about Galway and, you know, emerald lasses and blah, blah, blah. Man, as the night went on, the songs became decidedly hard, you know, about England and about violence and even modern songs about Irish youth growing up in America and then longing to return to go and fight against the English, you know. And I was like, whoa, like this was really jolly, and now it's gone real dark, you know. So that the songs of occupation, the songs of whatever it is that you want to call it, right? They're songs of resistance poetry. We have our own forms of resistance poetry in America. Can you think of some of particular communities that from which resistance poetry sort of emerges?
Like We Shall Overcome, something like that.
Absolutely. So within the civil rights era, and then in the 60s. What's that? Woody Guthrie.
This land is your land was a resistance piece. We don't use it
Right.
quite now, but
Yeah, have you ever, it's always so funny that everybody will sing the first verse. I'm like, keep singing. It's going to get real here in a minute. It'll start being jolly and get dark.
Kerouac?
Yeah, Jack Kerouac. The Beat Poets. You know, so we're in the 60s, but then in the 80s, there began to emerge a different kind of resistance poetry as well. Rap. Yeah. So,
that's resistance poetry, and boy, howdy, there was a lot of resistance.
Yeah, Public Enemy. And even now, I mean, to a certain extent, there's still some of that. But you know, it's all good, well and good when, you know, it's music from your era, right? But then when it's not, you're like, I don't want to put that in the same category, but it kind of is in a way, right? It's because you're like, how could somebody rejoice at the downfall of something else? You know, like, well, it's easy to do. You know, when it feels oppressive, when it is oppressive, when there's a system that exists within which something needs to happen. So the hard thing to hear when we read these passages is that God seems to be, you know, the hand of God, at least according to the prophet, is on the wheel of this whole thing happening and all these people being destroyed. That's the problem that we have with it, I think. But on the other hand, I think we understand to a certain extent, we can at least maybe identify to a certain extent with these people who are going, okay, after all this time, after all of the oppression, after all of the slavery, after all of the stuff, you finally are feeling it. You know, you finally got it. What all the rest of us have been feeling for a long time, right? So it's a form of resistance. It has lament in it because there's that element of it, but it's also, you know, it's like kind of a fist raising in the air kind of moment.
Maybe it's a social view coming out here, but I can just visualize all these people, innocent people on both sides. Harlots, they were the reason. I mean, the guys had to be there for them to be harlots, you know. And they just got slaughtered.
Sure. I think that's the issue that we have, obviously. Okay, so here's the bigger question. Now the rest of that stuff I was just kind of some exegetical work. You can kind of fiddle with that if you want. But there's some commentary issues I think that we need to kind of bring up before we end our discussion today. I have a little Q&A. So the passage does reinforce there's some ideological problems here with brutalization, which you bring up. You know, there's issues, right? There were innocent people that were caught up in this. That it was no fault of theirs. You know, they were just people living their lives, and their rulers, you know, did all these things.
And they were all spared in Jonah.
They were. You know, that was the idea within Jonah, right? Is that they were given a chance and they repented and they were spared, and then now in Nahum that's been rescinded. So you know, and you know, kind of our two contrasting, you know, moments here is you see a God of mercy and then a God of not mercy here. So in the Jewish mindset, you know, God's hand is on the wheel of both of these things. They're a little less enthusiastic about the Jonah version, you know, because that's left open. It's an open-ended thing at the end. There's a question that is never really answered. Just like we have the question at the end of Jesus' parable of the two sons, you know, where the father basically is inviting him to come in, and you don't know whether he goes in or not, you know. So that's all left up in the air in Jonah. Here, there's nothing left up in the air. So what's the problem with all of this, right? I mean, we can see the problem, right? Because we've hinted at it already. You know, you start waving your flags and getting all excited about the destruction of something, and then, you know, I mean, let me just ask a question. This is a provocative question. So how did you all feel when 9/11 happened, right? So when all that went down, and there were news, there was news and reports and video of Palestinians cheering. Pissed me off, right?
I always wondered if those were staged. There weren't many of them. Remember, there was like a line this long, practically doing it, and it's such an anti-Palestinian world. that we live in.
Well, so here's the thing.
Not right, but it is.
So here's the thing, right? That the image, and that's the important part of the image, right? Is that the image was used, and it elicited the response and you know what I mean? So whether it was staged or not, or whether it was just a few people, you know, the people that I met and have met since then were grieved by what happened and frightened by it.
Right,
And
because it covers
we're
that with a big
absolutely
brush.
terrified of what was going to come next.
Yeah.
So, but here's the thing, right? So you see the problem then, right? There's a problem with rejoicing over the fall of your enemy, right? Because there's a reaction that then is there too, and plus, you know, to sort of idealize brutalization then desensitizes you to it. It enables you to condone it much more easily, which is all the problems that we ran into after 9/11 when we basically did this to how everything was being done, you know, and I mean, you know, for good or bad, you know, it happened, and you know, we deal with the aftermath of that. There was a really interesting. I saw a guy. His name is Shane Claiborne. He's written a lot of great books, and he's done some amazing work. But I saw him speak once, and it was at this pastors' convention that was dominated by like a lot of Southern Baptist guys and others. And I was just like, they got Shane Claiborne there. I was like, I don't think they've read his books, man. So I show up, you know, and it's a packed house. And so he just written this book called Jesus for President, which is a really awesome book. And so one of his chapters was called The Amish for Homeland Security. And so, I mean, it's a super amazing story, right? Because and this kind of ties into what we're talking about here, right? So to idealize brutalization, to idealize violence, to idealize destruction and war and all the rest of it, you get caught in an endless loop of it, right? And the Amish were like, no. So there was that horrible thing that happened where that guy walked into a school and shot and killed, like, I don't know, like 12 young women, and it was horrible.
2006.
Yeah. So the community, they not only rallied and helped to pay for and do all the funerals for all the young women, they all went and rallied around the family of the young man for his funeral. And that story was like shocking to people. Like, how do you do that? How do you forgive? How do you embrace? How do you do that? And the answer was that you break the cycle. When you do that, you lay down your weapons.
So then we'll say, like, we have to do this.
This is who we are.
Yeah.
And so Shane Claiborne says to the group of people, he said, imagine if after 9/11, when basically the whole world was like with us, right? If we had said to the families of all of those people and the attackers, we forgive you. What can we do to embrace you? He was like, can you imagine if that had been our response? Like how different the world would be. And this is what happened in the room that was half full of all of these like pretty conservative pastors. They got up and they walked out. And I went, okay. You know, this is our problem right now. We are reaping the whirlwind of it, of decades and decades, long before 9/11, long before all this, long before any other thing, going all the way back to what you see right here. And so some of these books, you want to ask like why it's in here. Sometimes I think that the Hebrew scholars in their wisdom will wanted some of these hard texts to be here because it reminds you, like, we rejoiced, and then they rejoiced. the enemies rejoiced over us, right? Anyway, that's one way to look at it. But we still have some ways to go, right? We still have chapter 3 to go, where we really get into like how horrible Nineveh was. And then we're going to spend some time after that doing some comparison, I guess, with between Jonah and Nahum, and then really digging into like why it's so important for us to hold these two things in tension, and why we want to do that, like why we want to dig into this. Because then we start to see a more full expression of God. We're never going to see, everything, right? I mean, Moses got to see God's backside. And it gave him a high-pro glow. So, yeah, that was one of my spiritual mentors. His name is Rob Bell. I love all this. I love a lot of his stuff. But one of the things that he said, he did a whole teaching on the "you will see my backside," or "you will see my hind parts" is what it actually translates. He goes, we need to have T-shirts that just say "you will see my hind parts" and then have the verse reference on there, because a little, like Richard Rohr says, a little bit of God goes a long way. So we'll never see the whole of it, but we'll get some of it. Any questions before we go? Anything before we depart?
Not a question, but I did watch a little of Richard Rohr today.
Oh, good.
Speaking of him last week.
Yeah.
And I just watched a few YouTube things. I mean,
Yeah.
he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, he's one of those people that when you're in his presence, like when you're sitting talking to him, it's like, I don't know, you feel this thing just like emanating off of him, like love and wisdom and acceptance and all the rest of it. It's just bizarre. I've been around some pretty saintly people on occasion, but that was kind of marked. So it's kind of interesting. He's had a lot of health issues. I think he's really seeing the end of his journey and that kind of thing. But yeah. Anybody else? Comments? Awesome. All right. Thank you guys for being here. I'm going to pray us out, and then we'll leave, and I'll go celebrate with my kid. He'll be 15.
Oh my goodness.
Beginner's driver's license.
Oh, I know. I saw it on the counter. He printed it out, like how to get your driver's license in Texas. I know.
Not just his, but yours.
I know.
Someone else
Yeah.
to pick up Jake from.
I know. I'm so excited. I'm like counting down. I'm like, all right. So it'll be a year from Friday. I will be free from toting that kid to band stuff. All right. Well, let's pray. God, I know, right? God, thank you so much for this time together and for this great group. I pray that you would just continue to keep us coming back to the well of your word. And Lord, I pray that we would always find new refreshment, new ways to experience it. And God, that you would deepen our understanding of ourselves and of you. And we pray all of these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.